The dominant theme of this conference has been this acceleration of technology causing massive change to our society, and indeed what it means to be a human being. But the second major question that you should all be thinking about is, can we as a society manage the change in a way that preserves and hopefully enhances social cohesion, rather than a winner-take-all type society? 3 base comments to make about Australia before I get into the future. The first thing is that if you live in this country, you're actually pretty lucky. Lucky for a number of reasons. Firstly, we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world today in terms of per capita income levels. We have access to a good medical system, education is available to all, we have food security, we have clean water, we have, in global terms, a relatively strong social safety net. Over the last 26 years, we've had unbroken economic growth, something that's better than any other developed nation. So we're doing okay. So in that context, it may surprise you to find that inequality in this country is actually increasing. What we're doing here is we're just looking at what's been happening to household disposable incomes over the last 21 years. The numbers come from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We've divided households into 20% blocks from the poorest to the wealthiest. You should see 3 things from this chart. The first one is that everybody, every segment, is now in income terms better off than we were 21 years ago in real terms. The second thing you should notice is that we've flatlined over the last 10 years. And the third thing you might want to think about is, whilst the top 20% have gone ahead in leaps and bounds, they've got even more discretionary income than they had 21 years ago, the bottom 20%, despite all that economic growth, are still struggling. This becomes even clearer when you think about net worth. Net worth is really important because it gives us all economic security. When you look at what's happened over the last 20 years, which is the longest we've got in terms of comparable data, what you see is the bottom 40% of the population have barely increased their net worth, whilst the top 20% of the population have gone ahead in leaps and bounds. Indeed, we now have an Australian society where the top 20% account for 62% of all household net worth in this country. And the bottom 20% account for 1%. And the bottom 40% account for 6%. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of baseline introduction to Australia today is that despite all of our money and our so-called intellectual capacity, we seem to be incapable as a society of solving persistent social problems. And I've listed a number of them on the slide behind me. The third point about Australia is that if you just think about all of our ancestors, so virtually all of recorded and pre-recorded time, our ancestors have lived in a world of no change, where there's been minute economic growth. And then along comes the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, and from there onwards we've seen massive economic growth. And that economic growth has transformed this country from an agrarian society to fundamentally a service-based economy and a high-cost compliance economy. And it's converted us from an isolated economy, the tyranny of distance, to an economy that's intricately interconnected with the world, the global economy. Now, with those observations, I now want to just gently step into the future. And this is where it gets really strange, because intellectually we all get the fact that the change we're going to see in the future is going to be massive, and that because of that, the further out you go, the more impossible it becomes to forecast the rate of change and what's going to actually happen. And that's because there's just too many variables, which none of our models can take into account. But the really odd thing about us as human beings is that there's part of our sort of evolutionary brain that actually says that there won't be any change, or the change will be minute, or we've got masses of time to accommodate to the change. So, with those sort of introductory comments, I want to address head-on this issue that really is the elephant in the room, and that is what is going to happen to jobs in the future. And why is that the elephant in the room? It's because it's jobs that give most of us a sense of economic security, and for many of us it gives us a sense of self-worth. Now, this is the odd thing. When you look at all of the experts, there is consensus on one thing. And the one thing is this, that there's going to be massive dislocation in the future of existing jobs. Where the two factions start, where the experts start breaking up into two factions, is that this faction over here says, hey, with the acceleration in artificial intelligence and automation, there is no possible way we can create enough new jobs to replace old jobs as they become redundant. And indeed, there was a recent Australian report which suggested that up to 40% of jobs could become redundant over the next 10 to 15 years. Frankly, who knows? The second faction over here says, don't be stupid. Human creativity will create as many new jobs as jobs that are lost. And by the way, guys, remember the Industrial Revolution, and remember the Luddites, and we created new jobs. What this faction conveniently forgets is that the Industrial Revolution actually caused massive social dislocation. And they also forget that this time around, artificial intelligence is replacing our cognitive capabilities. Not muscle power, our ability to think and add value by thinking. But anyway, these two factions, they argue with each other, but then they come together and they say this, look, despite the fact we can't agree, in the future, if you want a job, you're going to have to constantly retrain for new jobs as your old job becomes redundant. And if that isn't the smoking gun in the room, I don't know what is. And for two reasons. In Australia, we shouldn't assume that even if we can create enough new jobs, we shouldn't assume that just because if we can, enough new jobs can be created to replace old jobs, we shouldn't assume in a globalising world that those jobs will be created in Australia. Yeah, companies seek to maximise profits, and the way you do that in part is to outsource jobs overseas to lower cost economies. And with ever improving broadband technology, it will become easier and easier for our companies to do that. So, the second reason to think about is that, or the second part of the smoking gun is this, that to expect people to constantly retrain for new jobs as old jobs become redundant is asking a hell of a lot of people. And what will inevitably happen in Australia is that that constant pace of change will leave a lot of people by the wayside, unable to cope with that pace of change. And what's going to happen, they're going to be left at the wayside at a time when government finances are strained because of an aging population. So why, as a society, why are we comfortable? Why are we complacent? Why do we believe that this time around we can manage the social change? Well, of course, we could manage social change if we had the right framework in Australia. And that's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the sectors of our economy from which leadership normally comes, these are basically the sectors. The first one is government. Government should have the responsibility for driving leadership on change in this country to make sure that we have social cohesion in a fast-moving world. But frankly, we're all switching off from government. This is a survey that the Australian National University put out after each federal election. And what they do is they survey voter attitudes to understand what the voters think. And they've done it now since the 1960s, and that means you can actually track trends and actually see the way the Australian population is reacting. And what this showed after the last federal election is 74% of the people surveyed thought that people in government looked after themselves. And only 26% believe that people in government were looking after our interests. Now, frankly, after the fracas we've seen in Canberra over the last 12 months, you would have to believe that 74% was now closer to 80%. We're all switching off, and yet we can't switch off because government is the entity that has so much firepower and so much capacity to actually manage change. The second sector is business, and I hear a lot of comments about, business should be more socially aware, and that's true, it should be. But at the end of the day, the DNA of business is to make profits, and we want them to make profits because actually profits drive economic growth. But that drive for economic growth is now leading to a situation where our big companies are actually reducing the number of employees they have. And a lot of them are doing that through automation, artificial intelligence, and offshoring. And National Australia Bank, the recent announcement, is a prime example of that. The third sector is the not-for-profit sector, an amazing sector that does wonderful things in our society. But the reality is it's resource constrained, and it can't even handle the disadvantaged people in our society today. And if you think about it, it's also starting to suffer mission drift because this constant need to replenish by going to donors and to governments means it's very hard for that sector to think independently. The fourth estate, newspapers, radio, television, the old-fashioned media, used to be the force that kept our politicians to account, but it's now a shadow of its former self, and we're left to a world of social media, biased media, fake news. How do we know what's true anymore? Who's actually interrogating the way the various sectors work in our economy? And finally, we've got the educational sector, full of brilliant people, but a sector that's badly lost its way, again suffering mission drift. It's driven for student volumes, a lot of those students coming in from overseas, rather than the excellence and relevance of the education it's giving the people going through the universities. And if you look at our schools are badly lagging the OECD leaders in terms of the rankings. So unfortunately, when you look at our current framework, you've got to say that it's going to be pretty challenging to manage acceleration and social disadvantage in this world of the future. So, what does that mean for Australians? It means that actually we're starting to get disillusioned. This was the slide from Ken Henry. Basically asked people in the survey this question: is Australia a great place to live? And 80% said yes today, but only 50% said Australia would be a great place to live in 10 years' time. The other thing, and it's even more disconcerting, is that only 20% of Australians thought that we actually had a vision for the future. And again, how do you actually manage change in the future if you don't have a vision? So, what are the game changers that can actually change that framework to being a framework that can actually manage this massive change that we're going to see in the interests of all of us? Well, the first one is we've got to reinvent our democracy. When you think about it, our democracy comes from a period not only before computers and telephones, but a period before electricity. It comes from a period where actually the best mode of overland transport was the stagecoach. Government currently takes about 36% of GDP. The other elephant in the room is that we've got to make government more accountable and more focused. What are the ways we can think about doing this? Well, the first thing is we can actually make sure that citizens have much more inclusion in the decision-making of government. And we can do that through technology. We're seeing an approach to that by GetUp today, which causes the politicians no end of annoyance. But actually, GetUp proves that the masses can actually have massive power when it comes to making government accountable. We need more personnel exchange. I mean, it strikes me as extraordinary that we talk about diversity, and yet we don't see lots of exchanges within government between business people, public servants, social sector people, educational people, and so on. Why do we demand diversity everywhere else, but we don't demand diversity of thinking within government? We need to think about virtual parliaments so we can actually make our parliamentarians more efficient so they can focus more on developing policy and getting out there with their constituents. We need to think about citizen juries, actually asking our citizens what they think about big issues. We need system transparency, so that may mean in the future that something like the ABC morphs into something completely independent of government, which is funded by government, which actually takes the spotlight back into government to make it accountable in exactly the same way the market seeks to make listed companies accountable. And finally, like this is an oxymoron, why on earth in this country haven't we got a commission for the future? Something that's funded by government but independent of government, taking people in from all sectors of the economy, experts, to really think about what the future means. and to think about the best way we can accommodate that future in the interest of all Australians. The second area is we've got to reinvent our legal system. Our legal system, let's face it, it's cumbersome, it's full of vested interests, it's slow and it's onerous, and it favours the wealthy. Why can't we use artificial intelligence to create a system that's actually available to everybody and which is cheap to use? We need to encourage everybody to be an entrepreneur. If jobs are going to go, the best way of creating a job may be to create a job for yourself by creating a business. We have a world today where we have technology platforms which mean for the first time in human history, I can have a niche business in Australia and I can cheaply distribute to the world. Our children are born as entrepreneurs and somehow we snuff it out of them. Entrepreneurialism should be at the centre of everything we do. It should be the core of our economic system, our educational system, and so on. We need to encourage more social businesses. Social businesses are businesses that are set up to solve social problems, not to maximise profits. To really make that happen, we've got to get government behind creating a market. And finally, we've gone from a world where we all lived in villages and we solved our social problems by talking to each other within our local communities. And what we've done now is we've outsourced problems to governments who actually are very ill-equipped to solve local problems. We have massive social resources in our communities. We've got to encourage governments to empower local communities, to have enough trust to give those local people the chance to solve problems for themselves. And organisations like Creativity Australia and Women's Community Shelters do just that through social franchise models. Now, I suspect some of you are saying, Peter, this is great stuff, mate, but mate, it's all too hard. We'll never get there, and you go back into your complacency. The challenge I want to throw out to all of you is that our ancestors worked incredibly hard and they sacrificed an awful lot to create democracy for all of us. We all collectively have the power to change this society. If we expect other people to change it, particularly if we expect our politicians to change it, it won't change and we'll have greater social dislocation in the future. So my challenge to all of you is to sort of get a bit angry. Then stand up, then have your voices heard, be proactive, and create change. Thank you.